John Fitzgerald Kennedy, 35th President of the United States of America, was, for a time, the most glittering political hero of the modern age. People had grown weary of tired old men mouthing tired old ideas. They looked like a bunch of shop-worn careerists who hadn't had a new idea since they left their mother's knee. Kennedy came like a breath of fresh air. He had youth and he had vigor, and he talked about exciting things like the new frontier, and he seemed eager to meet the challenges of the times. A people's champion had arisen who was going to banish disillusionment and restore our faith in political institutions. When he was assassinated at Dallas in November 1963, there was a profound sense of loss. But at least it seemed that his heroic status would be forever unquestioned. But some years later, ugly facts began to emerge about Kennedy. It seemed that he had a monumental appetite for women, and that one of his mistresses had connections with the mafia. This is just the kind of thing that modern journalism feasts upon. And every fresh revelation further blackened Kennedy's reputation. Yet the argument about Kennedy still rages. Was he a hero or not? The jury is still out, but I think we already have enough evidence to arrive at a verdict. Jack Kennedy was born in 1917, the second son of Joseph Patrick Kennedy, a wealthy Irish-American. Now, old Joe Kennedy was far and away the most important influence in the life of all his sons. He was an able but heartless, manipulative, unscrupulous man. When Franklin Roosevelt appointed him chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, he said, "Set a thief to catch a thief." In 1937, Joe Kennedy was appointed American ambassador to Britain. And he couldn't wait to express his admiration for Adolf Hitler. He told his cronies, "I'm for Hitler." And he told the German ambassador as well, to the horror of the British government. In November 1940, Franklin Roosevelt managed to persuade him to resign, and he departed for home depicting a Nazi victory within weeks. Joe Kennedy's recipe for his sons was simple enough. They must win at any cost. If they staggered out of some ball game dripping blood, old Joe booted them back in. Young Jack was the recipient frequently of some of his father's favorite aphorisms. Second place is failure. Don't play unless you can captain the team. Joe Kennedy had political ambitions for his children. Indeed, he wanted his eldest son to become president. But his eldest son, Joe Jr., was killed when his plane blew up over England in 1944. Joe passed the baton on to Jack immediately. He rang him up, curtly told him of his brother's death, and then added, "The responsibility is now yours." Jack Kennedy wasn't a stone-blind reactionary like his father, or an admirer of dictators. He liked Winston Churchill, and he had the guts to tell his overbearing father, who naturally enough was a staunch supporter of General Franco, that the Republican government in Spain was morally in the right. But though Jack could occasionally make his father choke on his coffee by expressing a progressive opinion, he couldn't resist his will. He loved him, and he was intimidated by him. So in 1946, Jack Kennedy became a member of the House of Representatives for the Cambridge district of Massachusetts. One of his friends asked him why he'd gone into politics. He replied, "My father wanted it." No, that's the wrong word. My father demanded it. You know my father. Kennedy ran in 1946 as a fighting conservative. And the story between 46 and his becoming president in 1960 is his gradual evolution from being a conservative to being a liberal. En route, he managed to disentangle himself from some of his father's more notorious associations, like Senator Joe McCarthy. From the time he was elected senator for Massachusetts in 1952, Jack Kennedy actively worked for the presidential nomination. He nearly got the vice presidential nomination of the Democratic Party in 1956. And some of his future celebrity was foreshadowed when a senior Washington correspondent said, "My God, he looks like a movie star." In 1960, after a brilliant primary campaign, Kennedy became the Democratic candidate for president at the age of 43. Already, his election techniques were very apparent. They were, of course, built around his own dazzling and carefully cultivated personality. But they owed even more to the large team of helpers he had, kept under iron discipline by his brother Bobby. He had a staggering entourage. There were speechwriters, opinion pollsters, public relations men, media consultants, what we call spin doctors, event planners, advertising experts, television experts, press experts, advance men who go on before the candidate to prepare the way for him, backup teams, and so I could go on. There was no species of guru that was not at Kennedy's disposal. Of course, Jack Kennedy wasn't the first politician to look at an opinion poll or to take some advice. He wasn't even the first politician to have his speeches written by somebody else. But the scale of the Kennedy operation made it a genuine innovation. Everything was planned. Practically nothing was spontaneous. What had been haphazard now became carefully worked out in advance. It was called the new politics. And what was the essence of the new politics? It was the belief that appearances are the dominant factor in politics. They matter and little else does. Of course, the experts who polished up Kennedy's campaign admitted that there was something to be said for the old professionals. They were quite good at shaking a few hands and smiling when being photographed. But the old pros simply didn't grasp what a full-time job in image management was. They simply didn't realize that you needed a large team, constant opinion polls to find out what the public was thinking, and all the time the recognition that every observable action of the politician must fit with the right image. Image was the only genuine reality. In an age in which most people watched television, the crucial thing was not what a politician was, but what he appeared to be. Of course, if the truth coincided with a favorable impression on the part of the public, so much the better. But it was the favorable impression that mattered, not the truth. And it was this formidable team that went into bat against the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon, who was Vice President of the United States at that time. Since the Democrats were the majority party, and since there'd been quite a severe depression, one might think that Kennedy had a fairly easy task in winning. But there was a huge obstacle to overcome. Jack Kennedy was a Catholic. America is a country that takes its religion seriously. Many Protestants had deep fears about popery and what they imagined it involved. They thought, amongst other things, that it might destroy the separation of church and state enshrined in the Constitution. No Catholic had ever become president. When Governor Al Smith of New York tried in 1928, he was beaten in a landslide. Kennedy's Catholicism might actually help him in some of the northeastern states, but the worry was that he'd be annihilated in the largely Protestant South and Protestant West. This was the acid test for the new politics. Kennedy could have been advised to avoid the subject altogether, or he could have been told to heroically face it head on and thrash it out. But that isn't how the new politics works. Kennedy did make one brilliant speech to Protestant ministers at Houston. But in general, he fought the issue not with arguments, but with image. In those days, the image of Catholics, particularly Irish Catholics, was of working men who weren't averse to a glass or two of strong liquor prior to singing Mother Machree. Indeed, a lot of the prejudice against Catholics was that they seemed lowly and they liked alcohol too much. Kennedy determined to project an image which would show that he was everything that a Catholic was supposed not to be. He had a patrician manner, with a clipped accent, with a lot of Harvard in it. He was very careful never to be photographed with a glass in his hand, and he was always stone cold sober in public. And far from being lowly, he was obviously stinking rich, as was proved by his expensive clothes and his expensive tastes and his trophy wife, Jackie. Of course, there was a danger in all that. You can have too much of a good thing. All this wealth and dazzle could produce an adverse reaction. And the spin doctors came up with a brilliant reply to that, a counter-argument that ran like this. Yes, Kennedy was outstanding and he oozed glamour, but he was Irish. He'd been born in a state and a city that had discriminated against the Irish, where in the not-too-distant past, the Irish had been given the jobs that nobody else wanted, treated like dirt, and allowed to die like flies. So this Harvard graduate, with his wealth, his glamour, was actually an underdog. And all this bright promise was going to be drowned in a tidal wave of religious bigotry. And that in America, a country that likes to reward merit and see a man get on. What a tragedy. Richard Nixon's assistants soon spotted what was happening. One of his friends told him that he knew Protestants who were going to vote for Kennedy just to prove that they weren't bigots. But what could Nixon do? if he raised the religious issue in any form, he too would be accused of bigotry. Ironically, the crucial point in the campaign seemed to prove the principal contention of the new politics, that it's only appearances that matter. In the first television debate, Kennedy had a full makeup, whereas Nixon only used powder, lazy shave, and it showed his 5 o'clock shadow. The radio audience thought that Nixon had won the debate, but the television audience plumped overwhelmingly for Kennedy. He looked better. Kennedy won the election by an incredibly small majority, and he wouldn't have done that except for the miscounting of the votes in Illinois and Texas, where the malpractices of the old politics came to the assistance of the image-mongering of the new. Neither of them in the least heroic. Kennedy's presidency was something of a disappointment. He couldn't get most of his domestic legislation through Congress. His attempt to get rid of Fidel Castro at the Bay of Pigs turned out to be a complete disaster, and the growing involvement in Vietnam was storing up trouble for the future. But most of this, if not all of this, was redeemed by his brilliant handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Russian leader, Nikita Khrushchev, had agreed with Fidel Castro that missiles should be placed in Cuba. American aerial surveillance picked them up, and Kennedy demanded that they be removed. For 13 days, the world trembled on the brink of a nuclear war. Kennedy had to press Khrushchev, else Khrushchev wouldn't have done anything. On the other hand, if he pressed too hard, there could be a nuclear war. We've just had the presidential tapes of the discussions of that time released. They show Kennedy as the coolest, wisest head in the entire government. He didn't cave in, but he ruled out any option that might lead to war. And he pulled it off. Khrushchev caved in, the missiles went back to Russia, and Kennedy had won. It proved that not everything that his public relations men said about him was a pack of lies. He did have strong leadership qualities, and he did have flair. And then it all ended, tragically, in Dallas, when 2 bullets from a telescopic rifle killed him. Lee Harvey Oswald was the assassin, and he was himself murdered in custody by Jack Ruby. Of course, an event like that always spawns conspiracy theories, and there are plenty of people who think that Kennedy was killed as a result of a plot, though who the plotters were changes with every account. Trying to assess Kennedy's status as a hero is made difficult by the fact that almost nothing about him was quite what it seemed. For instance, the American people thought that he spent his spare time at home in Hyannisport playing touch football. In fact, his health was very poor indeed. It was hushed up, but he had Addison's disease and required constant injections. His back had troubled him ever since he was a teenager. And when the Japanese sank his PT boat in the Solomon Islands, it gave him a wound that never healed. He had operations in 44, 54, 55. Didn't make any difference. It didn't get better. So Kennedy, the epitomization of masculine vigor and youth, had to carry out that role, perform that pose, pumped full of cortisone and wearing a painful back brace. Nor, on the same theme, were the American people aware of the seediness of his background and his associations. old Joe Kennedy had been a bootlegger, and he'd got many friends in the criminal underworld. The charges now made against Jack Kennedy are lurid. It's said that he had a close relationship with a mafia boss, that he took and gave mafia bribes, that he was planning to use the underworld to murder Fidel Castro. It has to be said that many of the witnesses against him in these charges aren't exactly pillars of the community. So I think we're entitled to give him the benefit of the doubt. But there's no question that by nature he was reckless. Take, for instance, these endless liaisons with women. It's difficult to believe that the American people would have forgiven him if they had known about it. It may well be that they would have thought an association with Marilyn Monroe was understandable. But I don't think they would have liked the idea of sex with mafia moles. It was an incredibly foolish thing for Kennedy to do. But the fact that much of his life was secret cuts both ways. If the public didn't know about the scandals, it also didn't know about some of the things that were very appealing. Kennedy was a caustically witty man, rather aloof, loved irony, was excited by ideas. Of course, his campaign managers thought it would be terrible if the American people found out any of that. Wit, irony, loving ideas, all that intellectuality, that was thought to appear elitist to the American masses. Well, we've got to come to an assessment about Kennedy as a hero, and I don't think that we can base it on anything trivial, like the scandals of his private life or even his wit. I don't even think we can base it on the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think we have to look at what is fundamental: Kennedy's legacy to politics. He didn't invent, but he pioneered the methods of the new politics. He welded together all the witch doctors and wizards of pleasing the people. And what was the central message of these witch doctors and wizards? What was their gift to democracy? Well, being bright, they weren't against intelligence. They quite enjoyed swapping ideas with the boss in private. In private. They thought that all cerebral activities should be confined to a small professional group, not given to the people who weren't up to it. You didn't waste time giving well-worked-out principled policies to the people. That was like casting pearls before swine. They weren't interested in policies. They wouldn't study them. They found them boring. They didn't want policies. They wanted gestures. They wanted to identify with a celebrity and a lot of showbiz razzmatazz. Has to be said that Kennedy himself had some reservations about all of this. He had got this mighty team which had won him elections, but he didn't really share its values. He didn't like, he was a man of some dignity. He didn't like the demeaning antics that modern celebrities have to get up to. He refused to dress up as a Red Indian or strum a guitar in public. The whole business of appearing to be what he wasn't made him uneasy. And when he was dumbing himself and the voters down, he always looked queasy while doing it. But do it he did. Whatever his reservations, Kennedy pioneered a technique of politics that has become absolutely dominant. Of course, it took time. whilst the Cold War was going on, ideology still had a place. You couldn't turn politics into a branch of show business whilst there was still a possibility that there might be a nuclear war. But subsequent to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the worldwide retreat of socialistic ideas, Kennedy's politics of image triumphed completely over the politics of ideas. 100 years previously, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, the Republican and Democratic candidates, had taken place in great debates. Yes, the people had had fun and there'd been banners and bands and all of that, but they'd learned something. They were addressed as if they were intelligent human beings who cared. And that went. And it went because of the new politics. We can't accord Kennedy heroic status after doing that, but his worldly success isn't in doubt. He's the Bible for every ambitious politician. If you want to see his monument, look around you.